you say to a student who comes to your class and says, I really would like to quilt, but I just am not creative?
Oh no, I tell people that you can become creative. You may not feel you're creative now, but you can teach yourself. Unlike any other skill, you can teach yourself to be creative, because all you have to do is open your mind and your eye. You have to learn to see things.
And so it allows us to be creative in a way that it doesn't require necessarily learning a new skill, or even if it does require the new skill, it's not an intimidating skill like, say, learning to pick up the paintbrush and paint.
Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of Running Stitch, a QSOS podcast. I'm your host, Yannick Smucker. We are back this fall, diving into more oral history interviews from the Quilt Alliance's Quilters SOS Save Our Stories Oral History Project, archived with our partners, the Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries and the Library of Congress. This season, we will again explore the archive of stories of quilts and quilt makers and bring back interviewees and experts to help us think about what quilts mean in American life. Running Stitch is generously supported by the Robert and Artist James Foundation, and this first episode of Season 2 is sponsored by today's guest, Ricky Timms, who has generously donated copies of his new book to the Quilt Alliance, the national nonprofit behind QSOS and Running Stitch. But we need your help too. The Nunn Center has completed digitization of the audio from our archive of nearly 1,300 oral history interviews with quilt makers. But in order to make this audio accessible and searchable online, we need to train volunteers to create indexes for each interview and build the digital infrastructure necessary to share these interviews with you. You can sponsor a QSOS interview with a donation of only $25, and an angel donor will match your gift dollar for dollar. Donors who contribute $100 or more may opt to receive a copy of Lizzie Albright and the Attic Window, the new chapter book for young adults by Ricky Timms and Kat Bowser. Please consider making a donation at quiltalliance.org. Ricky needs no introduction to many quilt makers. He hit the quilt scene quite accidentally, making his first quilt in 1991 when he inherited his grandmother's sewing machine. Let's hear him describe that first effort in his 2000 QSOS interview conducted at the International Quilt Festival in Houston by interviewer Barbara Beck.
When I was a child, I remember her sewing on her Kenmore sewing machine, and she made nothing that I remember that was fancy in the way of a quilt or a garment. She made practical things, and she patched things, and she reused things. And when she did make a quilt, it was chunks of scraps sewn together. Usually, the filling was an army blanket, a wool army blanket, and then the back might have been a flannel, and then she would tie these quilts together, and they were very heavy. Well, my mom says, Ricky, what of your grannies do you want? Well, my granny didn't have nice things, and I didn't want to fight over anything, so I said, you let everybody else pick, and I'll take what's left over. And what was left over was her Kenmore sewing machine. So the Kenmore sewing machine made its way up to St. Louis, Missouri, and it sat in the corner of my dining room for a week or two. My mother had showed me how to wind the bobbin, and I thought, well, if I know that, I ought to be able to do anything I want to do with this sewing machine. So I decided that I would make myself a shirt. So I drive off to the Cloth World store, and I go in and I start looking at the pattern book for men's clothing. While I'm doing this, the voice of my granny and the voice of my mother are both coming into my head. When I was a child, they would never make me a shirt because they said the shirts were the hardest things that you could make. They made dresses for my sister, they made dresses for themselves, but they never made shirts that I'm aware of. So I decided if I'm going to do something, I probably should start with something easier. So I turned around and there was a rack of quilt books, and one of them was called Learning to Quilt, Quilting for Beginners. And it had 20 sampler blocks of traditional quilt blocks. That first quilt is the only quilt that I made from a pattern, because My life as a musician had been in the creative part of music. I had been a composition student in college, and I love creating. So I immediately started adapting my own designs and creating my own quilts.
And within a few years, Ricky was winning top prizes at prominent quilt shows, as he described in 2000 in his interview.
Interestingly enough, now I know this is probably sounding like bragging, and I don't mean it to, because I am so grateful for this incredible thing that found me 9 years ago. But that quilt was my first large machine quilted quilt, and it won a Best Machine Quilting Award at a national show.
Isn't it a nice gift?
Yeah, and people say, you must have practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced to get there. And I didn't. It just came to me. And people say, how could that happen? I'm guessing, having been a pianist since I was 3 years old, I have pretty good eye-hand coordination, so manipulating that quilt under the needle with free motion quilting is it just came natural for me because I think of the piano background.
In 2009, Ricky was named one of the 3 most influential individuals in the quilt world, and that's no surprise, as the co-host and founder of The Quilt Show and publisher of lifestyle magazine Quilt Life, both with Alex Anderson. We've long known Ricky not only as a quilt maker, but also as a musician and composer. And in 2020, he published his first novel, which we'll discuss today. In short, Ricky Timms embodies creativity.
People that know me now know that I have been able to put music and quilting together in one package. As a musician, I took my first I taught through high school teaching piano. When I was 17 years old, I had been awarded several musical awards. I was also hired as a conductor of choral music for a church in Wichita Falls. I was 17. I worked my way through college doing that and teaching piano. And then I became a performing artist. I began working in studios. I had been doing conducting, I had been doing commercial work. I ended up in St. Louis, Missouri to be a professional recording engineer and music producer. I did the original music for this company, and they did commercials, jingles, small film scores, whatever, and I was writing music professionally. And then that company finally, it closed actually, and I bought the recording studio. I built the recording studio in my home, and I continued to work freelance, which basically means I didn't have a job. And it was during that time I started quilting because I had all that extra time on my hands. So now I incorporate music in my quilting. All of my quilting lectures incorporate either my piano playing, sometimes singing. I do a presentation called it's called Celebrate the Century. It's a historic perspective of music and quilts, and in 33 minutes you get 250 historical facts. You get 50 songs, and you hear all about quilting and history, decade by decade. So it's combining 2 passions, music and quilting, and that's pretty much what people mostly know me for.
And now, Ricky Timms has published Lizzie Albright and the Attic Window, co-written with Kat Bowser. I began my conversation with Ricky asking him to tell us about the book.
You know, who would have thought novelist would have got added to that list? But I will tell you, it was Kat Bowser, my co-author, that kind of came up with the seed or the nugget of this idea. But that was all the way back in like 2008, 2009. It was really quite a while back. She's not a quilter, but she loves, the industry I'm in. And she worked for me all those years ago when we were at a convention, and I was pointing out various quilts. And I said, oh, that one over there, that's called Flying Geese Blocks. And these over here, that's the Honeybee. And this is Grandmother's Fan, and that's a Bear Paw, and, and Sunbonnet Sue. And she saw those block names as characters in a story. And she said, it would be great to create some product based around a story. And we were going to write a children's book, and it was just going to be pictures and a short little story, and maybe a grandmother and a quilt, and we could get kids to sew and so forth. Well, but the idea went dormant for a while, and I'm trying to be very concise here, but it takes a while. The idea went dormant. The idea went dormant for a while, but in 2017, Kat chatted me up and said, let's revive this idea. I said, well, write a story. Let me see what you got. So she sent me a short story, and we laugh about it because it had some fun things in it, but it wasn't very, very well written. It wasn't very well developed. It was just kind of a fun thing. But the thing that happened with that is it gave me a vision, and a real big vision. What I saw, the potential, was a real serious novel, not just a small little, page book with pictures. And so we started sitting down and coming up with a synopsis. And we wanted this to be about a little girl and a grandmother as a nucleus. Although the story is not about a grandmother, there is a relationship there. And there's such great relationships with kids and grandparents that we wanted that to be an important thing. We wanted our heroine to be a young person. And in this particular case, we specifically wanted her to be a girl because we wanted to give girls empowerment at that age. We wanted to give them confidence that they could overcome obstacles. And that's kind of what happens here. I'm just going to give a real brief synopsis of the start. So our story starts on Christmas Eve, 1964. So 1964 would represent beehive hairdos. It would represent aluminum Christmas trees, station wagons with rear-facing seats, and the Beatles. Lizzie's favorite band is the Beatles. As a matter of fact, in truth, historically, the number one hit on Christmas week 1964 was the Beatles singing 8 days a week. And it won't spoil anything for me to tell you that in the land where Lizzie ends up in her story, they actually have, guess what, 8 days a week. So there's some fun things like that are happening in this story. Lizzie's birthday happens to be Christmas Eve, so she's turning 10 years old. And the family are trying to leave Overland Park, Kansas, where Lizzie and her family live, and go to a small town in southeastern Kansas that is the fictitious town of Cordelia, where her grandmother lives in a family mansion. It's up in this attic that Lizzie loves to spend her time playing, singing, telling stories, playing dress up, and so forth. And on Christmas Eve night, Lizzie is up there with her grandmother, and she discovers an old quilt, and she learns about this quilt, and she learns that her granny made it during the Great Depression as a way to work through her troubles because the family was struggling to survive the Great Depression. And when Lizzie learns the names of these blocks, it ends up sparking her imagination, and she sleeps under the quilt that night. And suddenly, in the middle of the night, she hears a tapping noise. She's learned all about the different blocks, and so the tapping noise she feels is coming from the attic. So she and the family dog, a Scottish terrier named McDougal, who has a strong Scottish brogue, they work their ways up to the attic, and Lizzie hears a tapping noise on the window, and it's a goose. And she's afraid that the goose is going to be trapped in the winter storm. So she gets upon the cedar chest, which held the quilt originally, and she opens the window, and the goose begins talking to her, and she finds out that she's supposed to be a princess, and she's got to save the kingdom. And so she goes through the attic window on the back of a goose with the dog McDougal, and they fly to where our story begins. So I haven't spoiled anything for anybody, really. And it's multiple. Hey. So I haven't spoiled anything for anybody. That's really kind of fun. And there are stories within stories. One of the things that I really love to tell everybody is that Lizzie's portion of the story starts on the morning of Christmas Eve and ends on the morning of Christmas Day. But the story of the book spans 153 years. So it's really stories within stories that all come together to create a story of empowerment, a story about bad decisions and consequences and betrayal, a lot of things that happen in the story. And it all is inspired by a quilt, but it's not a story about a quilt. So that's it in a nutshell.
I'm sure many of our listeners know you know some of the books you've written previously, quilt-focused books, and about your methods and techniques. How did you make that pivot from these are very different genres of literature?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't really know the answer to that. I just believe that if you want to do something, you can do it. And that's actually a theme in this book. If you believe that you can do it, you can do it. And so there's a situation in the book where Lizzie is supposed to go into a house, but the house is tiny. It's made for a goose. It's tiny. It's like smaller than a dog house, right? And she's going up there and she's like, I can't go into that house. And the goose says, well, come on, let's go on in. And Lizzie just walks right on in. And then suddenly she's in a living room and she's in this big space. And then it takes a while for her to realize that, wait a minute, I shouldn't be in here. And she's taught very early on in this story that not everything is as it seems. And Greta the goose says, if you believe you can do something, you can do something. And it's interesting that you asked me that question and I gave that answer because I wasn't prepared for that specifically. And it suddenly dawned on me, I wrote the novel because I believed I could write the novel. And I mean, of course, I did it with Kat. In the end, it was grueling. It was hard. It was frustrating. There were really obstacles in the way that literary obstacles, not physical obstacles, puzzle pieces to overcome. You want a result, but how do you get there in a plausible way where it's readable and believable to a reader? How do you create a goose character and make them believable? How do you get the family dog to talk and make it believable and convincing? And not only that, just the plot twists in the story. How do we make that happen? And so it really boils down to, I believed I could do it. I was determined to do it. I set my mind to it and I did it. And I do think that I have enough knowledge, education, savvy, whatever you want to call it, to know what a good book does. Good literary devices, good sentence structure, good storylines, and good pacing, as well as good descriptions. Bottom line is because I believed I could do it, so I did it. And I think that's my message to everybody. Don't think you can't, because the failure is to not try.
That's fantastic advice. So you've already were alluding to some of the specific challenges and sort of problem solving that you needed to do as part of writing this novel. How do solving problems when writing compare to solving problems when designing and making a quilt or composing music?
It is a beautiful question and a wonderful opportunity to share my passion about creativity. I'm not one to design a quilt from start to finish before I make it. I'm not one, of course, composing music is kind of like you're composing it as you go anyway, but with a quilt, for example, if I was to get my computer out and draw up the pattern and drop in the fabric swatches and change the colors and fix this and rearrange this and rethink this and do all of that, I've made all the creative choices when the visual image on my screen is done. That's called making a design, but I made all of the choices. There's no other choice left except now to manufacture what it is that I designed. So I am not likely to take that finished design on a computer, and I really don't have any inspiration to make that quilt. I've already made the quilt. I just made it digitally. I would rather give myself a roadmap. And so a roadmap might be, here's a set of blocks, or here's a pattern, or I've drafted out some templates of some kind, but let me choose the fabrics as I go. Let me make decisions as I go. And it's not so much my decisions that are being made as it is the decisions of the thing that is coming into being. My goal and my job as a creator is to be a facilitator for the creation. The thing is creating itself. It just needs a facilitator. And so the same was the story with this story. We came up with a synopsis for the story, but I can't tell you the number of times as I'm writing through the synopsis that the story is saying, oh, but this will be better. oh, but if you will leave that out and put this in. For example, we were going to have an animal council, and there was a bear that was going to be the leader of that animal council, and Lizzie was going to meet the council in a forest. She never meets a council in a forest, and the bear that was going to be a big deal doesn't even show up till the end of the story now, and he's a different role. So you have to let the thing be what the thing wants to be. And the more that you take charge of it, the more the thing loses control. And I can tell you the worse the thing will be. So in my case, it's just let it be what it wants to be and push through what it wants to be and be the facilitator for the thing that's getting created. And it doesn't matter if it's quilting or if it's music or if it's writing this novel.
Ricky has taught so many seminars and classes in which quilt makers learn how to unleash their creativity. Our QSOS archive bears witness to this. Let's listen to a few quilt makers recount what they have learned from Ricky in his courses.
Ricky Timms is another person who I took a class from and who gave me the freedom to just pick up the rotary cutter and start cutting. And I really like his work.
I like Ricky Timms' quilts because Ricky is so likable as a quilt maker and as a pianist, and he's always encouraging quilt makers. And so I'm drawn to his quilts too, just because I know that personality and that love of quilt making and quilters.
I asked Ricky about how he teaches people to be creative when they instinctively think they are not.
Now I realize that a lot of quilters, they follow the pattern. The pattern's already made. So there's not a lot of creative choices other than they don't have those fabrics anymore. So I have to figure out different fabrics. But as I teach as a teacher in the quilting world, I'm trying to teach that creative thing because quilters do have visions in their head of things that they, gosh, if I could just get this out of my head. Well, that's original. That's the creative process. And my job as a teacher is to pull that out of their head and then give them the techniques and the wherewithal to be able to see that thing to reality. It's so fun when I'm teaching a workshop in my little town of Levita, which I've certainly not done in the year of COVID here. But when I'm doing that and somebody has a vision, and to watch that vision evolve over the course of 5 or 6 days is a beautiful thing. And to see their excitement and their pride at the end of that is the reward. So the caveat to all that is let the thing have a voice and let you be the facilitator of that voice. It's so much more enjoyable.
How do you teach creativity?
Well, I start with the foundation that I believe that we are created to be creative. I believe that within all of us, there are creative abilities. And I use the example of you're taking the kids to school one day and suddenly there's a roadblock for whatever reason. There's been an accident or there's a pothole or the water main exploded. You will find a creative way to drive a different direction to get to where you're going. We are all creative in different ways. And as far as teaching creativity, there is a lot of discussion that goes on in a creative class, because the discussion is to do exactly what you just mentioned, and that is to get rid of the demons and the battles that we face inside, to go past those barriers to the person that you can be, to the creative spirit that you can have if you'll just push aside some of those barriers. And those barriers could be nothing more than a school teacher saying, well, I hope you don't go into art because you're not very good at it. Or a father who just said, stop messing with that. You'll never make anything of your life if you're going to do that. You know, if you don't get the encouragement, even at an early age, you can be a 55, 60, 70-year-old quilter and still believe what you were told when you were 6, 7, 8, and 9 years old. So part of teaching creativity is battling those demons and I've even done crazy things with different classes. It all comes out, but I can think of a class where they all had something that was really nagging at them, and they all wrote it on a piece of paper. We went over to the fireplace and we burned it, and we didn't burn it because it was some bit of magic. We wanted a visual symbol that they were trying to let that go and not let it eat at them anymore. So I don't know that I win all the battles with creativity, but I do watch it happen. And again, even in that role, I do not want to tell the student what decision to make or what to do. I want to be the facilitator. I want to be the encourager that lets them believe that they can do what they do and make the decisions that they need to make, whether they're right or wrong, because no creative endeavor is a home run every time. It's never always a home run. It's a journey. And we take that journey one project at a time, one day at a time. And if we learn something from the project, it just makes us better for the next one.
How do these different creative pursuits relate to and influence each other? I mean, just the plot summary that you gave us all for Lizzie Albright, I mean, we can see the influence of quilts and design, and I mean, music does, of course, play a role in the book as well. So how do these things connect for you?
Oh God, I don't even know how to separate them. They're so connected. The creative endeavors that we do, I mean, first of all, it's like you're driven to do it. It's the thing you're thinking about before you go to sleep. It's the thing you're thinking about first thing in the morning. So there's a passion associated with the creative endeavor, whether it's music or quilting or photography or writing. It's all creative.
So I'm sure our listeners will want to hear what you have in the works in terms of quilt projects right now.
Yes. So as far as right this very minute, the quilt projects have been the Lizzie Albright quilt, which of course is, it's out being sold. People are making it. The fabrics are there, all of that. I've created a Christmas wreath that's a 30-inch square wall quilt that's kind of based on the Dresden plate, but each of the blades of the Dresden plate are foundation pieced using kind of a braid design. And that just went on sale this week, and it has gone through the sky. People are just all over that. And then I did a crazy patch stocking, Christmas stocking, holiday stocking, because I really want kids in sewing. So I want grandmas or moms who may have, quilting skills to get the youngsters in their life to make their own stocking this year. So those are the two current projects. I finished an art quilt this year that I had put into the International Quilt Association Quilt Show. And that particular quilt, of course, none of us know what really happened because that show canceled. I did do a pretty significant quilt this year. So I'm still doing everything. It's just juggling it all and trying to be a business person and do all the things that you have to do to run a business. It's challenging, to be honest. It's extremely challenging.
Have you faced any particular challenges as an entrepreneur here during COVID-19?
Yeah, it has been horrific. I keep thinking that every month I'm on the brink of complete failure, to be honest. And I continue to keep my vision moving forward and struggling, but keeping my nose just above water. My basic income has come for 20 years from selling hand-dyed fabric, and primarily selling hand-dyed fabric at my seminars. So I would say 80% of the fabric that I sell is done at a seminar. I have had 0 seminars this year, so that's 0 income from seminars, and my fabric sales dropped off to the point of non-existence. I ended up losing the person who hand-dyed my fabric, and the gray goods that I actually used, the company that I got them from went belly up. It has been trying to reinvent and spin forward during this time has been, and here's the thing, I hope I don't sound like I'm whining, I'm just stating the facts. Everybody in this industry is struggling, and I am no special exception. It is a very, very, very difficult time.
Well, I wish you all the success with the novel. With the book is Lizzie Albright and the Attic Window, co-written with Kat Bowser.
I would just say to everybody, thank you for taking time to listen. And my message to you is to believe in the unbelievable and reach for the impossible. And remember, not everything is as it seems.
Wonderful advice for us all. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining me today for this episode of Running Stitch. It's been a real honor and a privilege to have this conversation with you, Ricky.
Thank you.
Running Stitch, a QSOS podcast, is a project of the Quilt Alliance, a member-supported national nonprofit dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing the stories of quilts and quilt makers. Running Stitch is hosted and written by me, Yannick Smucker, and I serve as co-producer with QSOS project manager Emma Parker, with support from Quilt Alliance Executive Director Amy Milne. This podcast is generously funded by the Robert and Artist James Foundation. QSOS oral history interviews are archived with our partners, the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries and at the Library of Congress American Folklife Center. You can listen to full interviews and see photos of quilts at our website, qsos.quiltalliance.org. Running Stitch features music by Chris Eselgroth, accompanied by a singer featherweight, and Amy's Best Sewing Shears.